Please welcome Celia King to the stage.
Hi, if I haven't already met you, my name is Celia. Hi. I'd like to start by thanking you for being a welcoming community and being incredibly helpful to newcomers. I started learning Ruby last year for the Rails Girls Day that I went to with Vanessa. And as she mentioned, we blithely dove in and broke things on our computers and broke things on the internet and had a lovely time with a great team of mentors supporting us. But the help didn't stop there. We started coming to these meetups and people kept helping. I was chatting to one of you and it quickly became apparent that I knew little to nothing about TDD, or test-driven development. So you gave me a crash course. I was enchanted, red, green, magic. But it didn't stick. And by the time I got home, I couldn't remember how, so I didn't. Then you showed me a second time. I was still a bit shaky on how to write the tests, but I took notes and I got a better sense of what was going on. And I was catching on to the reasons why you should do test-driven development. It made total sense. You have an idea, you work out the smallest thing that you want to make, so you write a test for that. You check to make sure that your test fails, you write some code, you check again, it passes, and then you keep going. And there are lots of reasons why you should adopt a TDD approach to writing code. It makes you think about what you're actually trying to do so that you don't forget your purpose. It makes you think about whether what you're doing is viable. It also means you can change your code around afterwards and see if it still passes. And it means you can find your bugs more easily. I was convinced, but I didn't want to. I was having enough trouble making the Ruby go. Now you want me to learn something new? No, I am just doing the coding part. I just want to make things. I don't want to slow down and do this TDD stuff. I don't want to write tests for each bit. But people whose opinions I trust told me TDD was important. Very sensible books told me TDD was important. The internet told me TDD was important. So I persisted in learning RSpec. I had a crack at exorcism and other things with testing in them so that I could see how it worked, but it was grudging. Then you suggested I do a lightning talk on TDD. And I looked at you and I secretly thought, buddy, the only reason I'm doing this TDD thing is because you said so. I'm still half convinced it's a trick. I persisted. It took me a little while to realize that the feeling of not wanting to write tests was familiar. It was familiar from knitting. This got me to wondering whether the testing you are supposed to do for knitting is similar to TDD. I had already decided that writing knitting patterns was like writing code, so does TDD work for knitting? When you are knitting something, you are supposed to knit a test swatch first to find out your gauge or how many stitches and rows you get per inch with the yarn and needles you're using. In this example, this is the same yarn, the same number of stitches, but 3 different needle sizes, which gives you 3 completely different results. Typically, a swatch is a 4 by 4 inch square. That's a good balance between getting a sound idea of what your average gauge will be and not having to knit too much. If you know your gauge, it helps avoid problems like this. These are socks knit for a 5-year-old. They were knit for me by my mum, which suggests that perhaps reluctance to swatch is a generational problem. As well as testing gauge, you can test for construction. So if you do a swatch that tests construction techniques, it helps you avoid problems like this. Oh shit, gauge is important. Helps you avoid problems like this. If the person knitting that cardigan had sat down and knit a few test calculations to work out the shoulder construction, instead of just doing it on the fly, it would have saved her a lot of time and frustration fixing it afterwards. As an aside, I should also mention that it's important to document your knitting if you're making up a pattern, because chances are you'll put the project down, and when you pick it up again, if you've done 3/4 of, say, the button bands, you will not remember what technique you used, and it will be a crapshoot whether you get the last part to match the first part. Look, I was supposed to put this on, but it's really hot. So I'm going to try it, and I may be taking it off again really soon. So to get back to testing, and to leave construction techniques aside for the moment, there are 2 different ways you can use a gauge swatch as a test. If you are following a pattern, the pattern tells you what size, what your gauge should be, and you test needles and yarn sizes until your gauge matches what's specified in the pattern. If you are writing a knitting pattern, the swatch tells you how to write the pattern. This is an example of my documentation of a pattern, which explains a lot about my knitting. So, could I have used test-driven development to make the process of knitting this cardigan better? The answer is sort of. I saw this pattern on Ravelry and decided I wanted to make a cardigan version. I used the motifs in the pattern and made up my own construction for the garment. I should have knit a gauge swatch to test all the information I needed to know about how many stitches to cast on and how to do the arm increases. The arms did not get increased enough. That feels similar to writing code, but there's no fail step that I can think of. I should also have knit a test swatch to work out the shoulder construction. I've knit jumpers from the top down before, and I assumed that it would be the same knitting from the bottom up, and it wasn't. There's some neck shaping I should have knit a test swatch for, but in this case I got away with it because it's the same top down and bottom up. And I'm taking this off now. So it's not an exact analogy to say that the testing you do in knitting is the same as the testing you do in coding, but the reasons behind using TDD still apply. The test swatches would have helped me focus on my purpose. I was trying to make a loud cardigan with Australian motifs that fits. And test swatches would have let me know that my idea about how to knit the shoulder in this context was viable or not, and it certainly would have helped me find some of the bugs which I haven't mentioned. A TDD mindset will make your knitting better. So, given I believe TDD is good for knitting, and I've thought for a while that knitting and coding are similar, I have to believe that TDD will make writing code better, which is not the same thing as being confident in doing it, so you helped me again. I recently read Emily Suvada's novel, This Mortal Coil. One of the ideas in the novel is that everyone can read and change DNA. The main character, Kat, finds a string of DNA in a passenger pigeon that doesn't appear to do anything. The novel says Kat translates the base pairs into binary, the binary into ASCII, and the ASCII into a string of alphanumeric letters. And she discovers it's a bit of a poem. The book doesn't translate all the poem for you, but gives you the DNA strings at the end and challenges you to translate it for yourself. We wrote a whole lot of tests to make sure, and made them fail, and then wrote the code to make them pass. We made tests to make sure that the base pairs mapped to the right thing, A and T to 0, C and G to 1. Then we got a bit of ASCII and what it mapped to write a test to see if that worked. Then we tried the first word of the poem. It all worked. I got to practice writing tests, and I got to read the final bit of the poem that isn't in the books. It's not a great poem, but I was quite chuffed. So thanks to your help, I have now taken on TDD as a useful tool for knitting and coding. I feel more comfortable writing tests for my code and will make better cardigans. I hope you enjoyed my path to deciding that TDD is quite useful. You can find me on Ravelry and Twitter as Seals. And also, if you're free the second weekend in May, you should come to Rails Camp. Thank you.
Hello. That was wonderful. I was wondering if you considered declaring the shoulder of your cardigan a feature rather than a bug.
Look, so the way I fixed it was I tucked it in and sewed it up. I still haven't finished the cardigan. It needs a collar, it needs a few other things, but it gives you quite a nice 80s shoulder. So maybe it's a feature.
Who else?
I am prepared to say no to this question.
So when is the last time you needed a swatch?
No, I need 3 for this talk. So if you're going to ask if I need them after the cardigan, then I'm not answering that question. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Celia.